menu combat. I'm your host, TheWolvesDen, and there are 3 parts to every week's episode. What am I grinding on? What am I reflecting on? And what are some of the Hall of Fame JRPG songs that we should be thinking about? And surprisingly enough, I'm still playing Dragon Quest 1. I literally just beat it last night. And you know what actually stood out to me? Was this feeling of going back to the NES manual. So I mentioned to you guys last week that I took a quick perusal of the Dragon Warrior manual that was packaged with Nintendo Power. And so for many folks who played Dragon Warrior back in the NES days, they actually had a full guide. Now, when I tell you this guide is comprehensive, I'm talking about they tell you all the spells you learn at each level. They give you the maps of each of the dungeons. I think there are 4 dungeons in the game. But more importantly, it is both about like trying to create a story component of this is Colin. And what's funny is that Dragon Quest is a whimsical game. When you look at the designs that Toriyama made for the monsters, it's whimsical, it's really charming. But the art that they're selling this with is hilarious. So if you look at the NES pixel art, there's not much there, right? Like it's an NES game, the graphics aren't that really robust. But it allowed them to kind of fudge around of how they're selling it. So as I mentioned, Dragon Quest, when it was released in the NES back in the late 80s, was called Dragon Warrior, and all the art just looks straight out of D&D, which makes sense, right? Like Dragon Quest is pulling so much from Ultima and tabletop games and trying to like make a simplified and streamlined approach to that way of combat or experiencing adventure. But when I tell you, this art does not match Toriyama at all. It's like this jarring thing, but the booklet is just gorgeous. When I tell you the D&D art really is evocative of like Cary Norad. So if you've ever read like the Dark Horse published era of Conan comics, that's what it feels like it's getting into. So Cary Norad's art and Busiek's writing, and obviously these are not the same, but I feel like there is a gravitas when they show the picture of the king. It's this really like dramatic looking character, but he doesn't say much in the game. I think this is a perfect example of marketing trying to sell you on the idea of the game to sell it to an American audience, right? Because that's the other thing. This game tells you how to use a command system. They literally have phrases where there's no substitute for experience to really emphasize the role of grinding. They talk about listening to visitors. So there's this little picture with the main character surrounded by like dark people in the shadows. Like, you gotta listen to them. They're gonna give you real good information. They're really trying to communicate, which makes sense as one of the first real JRPGs in the Western market, and obviously for one of the first real home console JRPGs in Japan. You're trying to communicate, how do you play this game? What's the mindset to take on? And it's just a charming look. I recommend anybody who wants to like take a blast to the past, a blast to the past to really examine and take a look at some of the physical media that our gaming ancestors had, or predecessors, or forebearers, whichever you want to call them. It's a really nice flashback, and I think what's unique is that this is very much about communicating the drama, the theatricalness that the game is trying to suggest to you, and teaching you how to play the game. And I think that's something that leans a little bit to a conversation where I said, where it's like sometimes when we talk about physical media, like physical booklets, these are things that used to accentuate what you would play, and we don't necessarily have that. Maybe you could argue that graphics have gotten to the point, or in-game tutorials have gotten to the point of really clarifying how to play and how to explain, and doing the expectation that the in-world game scenarios need to be described in a certain way. I'm open to that. I just do think it's interesting just to think about like the role that particularly physical magazines play, and maybe we do have a version of that. I think so much. I mean, for me, I look at guides online still. Like I think it's called Woody US, is a Dragon Quest fan site, and so like Cave of Narsh is one for Final Fantasy. So it's not as if we don't have what would be the equivalents. And I don't know if you guys find fun of going down the rabbit hole of looking at old forum posts from like 2005, before anything, seeing just what people were saying. And so we do have a version of that. I think part of me is always fearful in this day and age that we're going to just lose things. And we do lose things. We lose things to the internet all the time. Websites aren't forever. And so, like, the passion of fan sites are holding it down, but you might lose it. And I think it's equivalent to represent an idea and a thing, and the way that people talk about lore on forums and discuss it is probably the equivalent of what you'd like briskly go through in a book. And then we get access to renders of characters and character art. I think the one thing that we don't get, and I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing because I place a priority on official art, but this game really made me realize, artistic renderings of games, especially in like a 16-bit era, or even 32-bit era, the art was doing a lot of work to tell you what the pixels or the polygons were trying to communicate. I don't know if we have many examples now of video game art very different from the video game in-game art, right? Like the representative official renders or anything. I think those are usually now one and the same. I don't think we get a big difference like we used to. But there's value in that in terms of just like the way that you frame certain things. Like I'm thinking for a lot of people my age, how important that Marvel vs. Capcom art was to really what the X-Men were, right? Like that's not official X-Men art. That's not coming from the books in the mid-90s when you're reading Onslaught. No. But if you ask people what their ideal image of Wolverine is, they're probably going to point to Marvel vs. Capcom on box cover with Wolverine pointing at the side. And so the power of certain artwork that are very different from the in-game graphics is something that I don't want to say we don't get, but right now in my brain I'm even thinking about like the release of Street Fighter 6 right now, where the art and the actual in-game thing are the same, and that's beautiful in one way. But I think we've lost just a smidge or something, not a lot, but enough to be like, I hope that we get more interpretations of characters, because I think that's what it is. Getting multiple interpretations of characters can be fun. I know that's a little side tangent, but it was on my heart. The other thing I want to highlight is when a game breaks its own rules. So part of what made me, I was dreading going back to Dragon Quest 1. I'm going to be honest. I was so hyped about Rim of Ladar, but I noticed that I was avoiding playing Dragon Quest 1 right afterwards. And I just wasn't in the mood for the grind. And I feel like I had seen everything that Dragon Quest 1 could provide. I was like, you know what? There's not much here else for me. I got it. I was wrong. See, I finally decided to go on the other side of the map that I mentioned where Caitlyn and all that is. And I got hoodwinked. And it was kind of fun. So when you go back on the other side of the map, so you get your magic keys, you do the Grave of Golem, you do all the magic key stuff in Tangtel, you collect the Staff of Rain. The only thing left is to go towards Damdara and Caitlyn. And so I don't know what's going to happen in Damdara. I go into Damdara and it's wasted. And I'm like, a town wasted? What is going on here? And the minute I step into town, I go into a battle. And I'm like, hold on. Dragon Quest has never pulled this to this point. You do not do any battles in town. It's always been in caves and the overworld. You treat towns as if they're sacred, safe spaces where you could collect stuff. And this game just broke its own rules. I got bodied and I had to redo the travel. But it was like, this game still got tricks up its sleeve. And more so, one of the things I've highlighted as a JRPG technique that I place a lot of value on is using in-town battles to communicate something. And so they did a great job of communicating that town is wasted if you're going to get attacked by enemies that are even higher than the outside overworld. It was great. And so I go there, I get bodied, then I go back and I'm like, you know what? Maybe I need to be somewhere else. And so I follow the map, and this is where one of the things I started thinking about is really cool is the value of a map. See, I am a person who, I don't know how much I really care about the world map in JRPGs. A lot of people who are of my ilk, a lot of you probably listening right now are probably like, I love the JRPG world map where you're abstracted into it. And I just didn't really get it. When I played FF9, I was like, yo, this is a waste. And so when I know that FF10 cuts out the world map, I'm not bothered. Even looking at something in Dragon Quest 11 back there, the fact that you are really just traversing onto it without the abstraction doesn't really bother me except for the boat stuff. And so for me, I don't really get why we appreciate it, but I realized for me it was learning how to navigate and using that to like piece together what is the route I'm going to take. Is this route safe? So there's deceiving routes that if you were just to go across a bridge or whatever, you would not end up where you were trying to go to progress. And I realized I was just like reading the map. I was like, okay, I need to be careful when I'm exploring, go here, and I was like, oh, that's changed my relationship to this game, where I'm really using the map to make sense of my journey. And it really did feel like an adventure. I'm charting my own place. And I wonder, because I'm playing the Switch version, if that's really the equivalent of how it was in NES, or did you have to collect the map? I'm hoping that people were able to have the map from the get-go. But I charted the map, I got lost, I pulled myself back together, and then I ended up to the place where I was supposed to, where I was like, oh, this is trying to tell me to go to the wrong place. I ended up in Caitlin. And the cool thing about Caitlin is that you start using the information from previous villages. So early on in Cole, they tell you, hey, you need the fairy flute to get into this place. And if you don't have the fairy flute, you're going to get bodied. And so literally, if you go, there's a special boss battle with this huge golem. And if you just battle it straight without using the fairy flute, you are going to lose. And so I felt like, oh, I paid attention to what they told me, and I used the flute consistently in this battle to make it fall asleep, so I had an advantage, because otherwise I'd be overwhelmed. And it was like, this is what it's like to really be immersed in Alefgard. The people in Cole told me something, I listened to them, I carried the instrument, and I had a boss battle, and I beat the boss battle. And I think all I keep wanting to communicate is that Dragon Quest 1 is just good at secrets. It's good at making things feel special in a way that I don't think you can take for granted, right? Because I play a bunch of other games, but they don't necessarily make things feel special. Like, this is not to besmirch Secret of Mana, the Star Ocean First Departure. Star Ocean First Departure, I played that on Switch. I stopped for a while. I'll go back to it eventually. The things that feel special in that game are not about uncovering secrets, and that's a whole different ball game. And the other thing I want to highlight is reoccurring motifs. Dragon Quest here has, I mentioned the fairy flute to make the golem go to sleep. You have that fairy flute gets used over and over again. At least in 5, it's a major melody that gets you access to an entirely different world. And so I always wonder about playing certain games and then seeing how certain tropes become like iconically important and used over and over again. It stood out for me. When I tell you, this game is really trying to make things feel special. So you beat the golem, you talk to everybody inside, and then you meet this guy, and he's like, yo man, back in Damdara, my family used to have a legacy shop, and it was really important. And he's like, there's something really important to the east. And you're like, okay, there's something really important to the east. That's where your shop is. And you speak to somebody else who's like, you might be able to find something important. And I decided to make a trip back to Damdara. I leveled up some more, and I went in and I saw a sparkling thing. I'm like, oh, that is something special. And what I got was Erdrick's armor. Erdrick's armor is the best armor in the game, but I just assumed that it boosted your defense. I was wrong. I noticed that when I was making my cross trek back, that when I walked over poison, I didn't lose HP. And I was like, oh, this is not just like effective armor. This changes how you play the game. And then I also learned that if I battle an enemy, lose some HP, if I keep walking, it regains the HP back. And I was like, oh, this is special. And this is, I think sometimes when people talk about, I want special armor that makes things feel important. This really felt that way, and it felt like a natural part of the game of like, you were following the legacy of Erdrick. And I'm thinking so much to this experience with this town in Damdara, seeing it wasted, learning about the family learning about the family used to owning a shop, the fact that people evacuated Caitlin, it makes me build up of like, what happened to this place? Because as I mentioned, Dragon Quest 3 is technically a prequel to this, and it sets up so much of like, oh, there's something important that happens here with the hero, Erdrick. And then I beat the game, and I gotta be honest, I was punked again. Again, when I tell you this game has so many secrets I just wasn't anticipating. I do the dungeon. The dungeon's really meticulous and long, but you've grind enough, you got it, you get your sword. I use the map to figure out things, whatever. I get to the Dragon Lord, and I'm like, all right, time to knock this guy out. And it's a hard battle. I beat him, and I'm like, yes, it's done. And then he transforms. I'm like, oh shit. I didn't even know that they would be doing this back in the NES era. And then he turns into an actual, so there's a Dragon Lord, he turns into a purple dragon, and you beat the purple dragon, and you're like, shit, that was a hard battle. I lost that battle like 2 or 3 times, doing it over and over again. It was great. And I was like, to think that this game continued to have stuff up your sleeve, because I just didn't expect it. I didn't think an NES boss battle, like JRPG boss battles have multiple forms. That's a normal thing. That's a stereotype. But to think back in the NES era, that's how they did it, and maybe I'm not familiar with other RPGs before this, but that's just not something I expected. And it made me realize what Dragon Quest XI does with Act 2's boss is entirely cribbing from this. One of the things that people have talked about with Dragon Quest XI is it's a lot of homage back to the old game. So I've only played 5 before I played 11, and I'm playing 1 now. And I was like, oh, I see it. And so you beat the game, and you're outside, and you have flowers around the castle, you see Tangtil Town, and you're like, I did that. When I tell you, this was just a fun experience at the end. As I said, they pulled the floor under me. They pulled the rug out from under me many times, and it really made me feel like this game has some special things. Now, do I think it's like the greatest thing ever? Has it aged? I think all of those things are true. But this is proof that less graphics, less technical skills doesn't mean that you can't have impeccable design. Dragon Quest 1 is a fun game. It's about 10 hours. And if you can get into the rhythm of grinding, because you just gotta accept that many moments you're going to grind, you can appreciate the secrets and details of how to convey, especially what I haven't even really talked about this, but it's really a 1v1 RPG. Something that everything I think after this is party based, and how that changes things I'm excited to see. So that's what I've been grinding on. What is the thing I'm reflecting on? Oh man, you know what I've been reflecting on this week? I mean, I'm a hip hop fan, so the answer, obviously, me saying hip hop is not a surprising thing. But earlier this week, there was an announcement for a new Prince of Persia game. I think it looks cool. The first thing I thought is like, oh, this is like the 2D joints I used to even try to play on my mom's phone, because you know that they ported those 2D Prince of Persias everywhere. And I was excited. And the comments are horrible. I think there are 3 reasons. 1, people just need to be damn patient about the Prince of Persia remake. So I get some of that. But they don't like how the main character looks. I think that's a euphemism for the fact that he's black and he has dreads. But whatever. I get it. People want to see the prince, but they've told you that the prince is captured in this game. Whatever. But really, the thing that got under my skin was like people getting mad at like the use of hip hop in this trailer. And mind you, it's not in the game itself, right? Like obviously the core Prince of Persia game is not going to have that. And so I don't think anything of it. But people were like really angry that it sets up the tone. But as like, I think really it comes down to that there's just a lack of respect for hip hop and hip hop producers. And obviously hip hop means so much to me. And I also just think that you don't appreciate the musicality that producers have. And mind you, I will be honest, a lot of the hip hop that gets used in gaming trailers is not hip hop that I really care about, or hip hop that, as I think, really reflects the culture. I don't think since the mid 2000s have we really had many games that really capture hip hop in a meaningful way. I think you have the Def Jam games, and I think you have the NBA Street games. I think that era of EA Big was really able to tap into that in a very authentic and representative way. And I still do think the 2K soundtracks do a good job. But if you're talking about really getting into representing hip hop as the wider thing of acknowledging artists and stuff, I don't think we have that. Shout out to Parappa the Rapper. Obviously, I'll mention that. I think, if I remember correctly, the second Parappa the Rapper game had a song done by De La Soul. Cool bit of info for you. Anyways, this is a JRPG podcast. So why am I talking about hip hop? I mean, I'm going to always talk about it, but more so, I was really trying to reflect on which hip hop producers have the skill set, the wherewithal to make a great JRPG soundtrack. And so I'll tell you some of the things that was running through my head. One, I have to think that this hip hop artist has to have produced a lot of songs. I'm thinking when you play most JRPGs now, they're like minimum 30 tracks, but you hit 40, 50, 60. And so you need an artist who's at least been able to do that, has a high amount of production credits to their name, just so to really represent that. And then you really want to match the tone. You want to match, like, oh, I can see a synergy. But I think for many people, the producers I'm going to pick right now, you may or may not know them. So what I'm going to do right now, for the sake of this, is that I'm going to mention the artist, I'm going to mention the franchise, and I'm going to mention a title theme, a battle theme, and a town theme. Now, for the sake of protecting the rights of this podcast, you're not going to hear all those things here, but I am going to create a playlist that incorporates all three. And if you are familiar with these producers, it should make some sense. But I want, this is something that's been on my mind for a minute, and I think it would be really impactful. So here are the three people that I've been thinking about. I think JPEG Mafia would be great at a Shin Megami Tensei soundtrack. I think Prince Paul would be amazing on an Earthbound soundtrack. And I think The Alchemist would be excellent at a Final Fantasy soundtrack. Now, let me explain some of these. So I'm going to start with Prince Paul. Anybody familiar with Prince Paul? Prince Paul is a producer dating back to Ultramagnetic MC, Sonic. And then he worked with De La Soul for 3 of their albums, 3 Feet High and Rising, De La Soul is Dead, and Balloon Mind State. He goes on to work with Dan the Automator for Homeboy Modeling School. And so he has a range, and part of what makes Prince Paul, and especially that early De La Soul stuff, really impactful is that it's a little bit whimsical, it's a little bit silly, it's a little bit jovial, and you can immediately see that these descriptions of phrases make it kind of appropriate for an Earthbound soundtrack. And then I think I'm pulling a lot from the Homeboy Modeling School era, because I just think the place where he and Dan the Automator went musically was just truly different. So I'm thinking, if you were to do Prince Paul doing the Earthbound, what would the title theme? And the title theme would be I Am I Be from De La Soul, from, if I have it correctly, 3 Feet Higher and Rising, or no, sorry, De La Soul is Dead. The battle theme would be Magnetizing from the Homeboy Modeling School, and then the town music is If It Wasn't For You, Homeboy Modeling School. And what I mentioned at I Am I Be is just like this really relaxing, a little bit quirky, chill music. And then I feel like with the battling theme, you got to incorporate more of that unorthodox whirling sound effects. On my previous producing project, I really leaned into using some Earthbound sound effects because it gives us such a different tone and feel, a little bit off-centrally off kilter. And when you listen to the battling theme, as I mentioned, Magnetizing from Homeboy Modeling School, you'll be able to hear that throughout. And so those are some of that's my first choice. Prince Paul, Earthbound. The next one, I think, is the one I'm most excited about. JPEG Mafia and Shin Megami Tensei. I think listening to a bit of the Shin Megami Tensei 3, 4, and 5 soundtrack, you have to have some abrasiveness. You have to have a little guttural, some distortion, some really electronic components. And all those things are very JPEG Mafia. I mean, if you listen to Scaring the Holes this year, you know what I'm talking about. But here's where my brain was at. I was listening to the Shin Megami Tensei 4 theme, and I was like, go listen to 1539 North Calvert, and you tell me off of JPEG Mafia's Veteran, tell me you don't hear that. It is the fact is that JPEG Mafia and post-apocalyptic, abrasive, but beautiful synths when necessary is when I think of a lot of the Shin Megami Tensei soundtrack and very much his work. And so I was thinking about what would a battle theme sound like. And so you need something a little bit laid back, a little bit of energy. And I was listening to Sick Nervous Broke off of the recent project he had prior to the collab. I was like, yes, I feel the atmosphere. Atmosphere is just dripping through this. And then lastly, I thought about some town music, and I went with Bald. And I feel like this could be like a Neo Tokyo. You speak into a demon, but it's a little bit loungy. Tell me that JPEG Mafia Shin Megami Tensei is not a match made in heaven production-wise. Now, the hardest one, I'm not going to lie to you. I think anything that gets into a little bit more modern taste, Shin Megami Tensei tends to be post-apocalyptic, but from now, or even Prince Paul and Earthbound being modern, it is easier to imagine a hip-hop approach and soundtrack. I think the hardest one, the one I was really wrestling through, and I think this is the one I might get some pushback, is Alchemist and Final Fantasy. I wanted to push myself to really think about this. And I thought there are a couple of things when I think of Final Fantasy that I think Alchemist can evoke. Can he capture the beauty and elegance? And that's the one thing that Alchemist can do in spades. He has a lot of music that just sounds pretty, lush. And so when I think about a potential title theme off the E. coli project, there was a song called Rey Mysterio, and I was just like, it is elegant, it is smooth, it's got some strings, and I feel like those things can make for a nice tone setter for Final Fantasy. Then I was wondering, what is the battle theme? See, this is actually the most challenging part about Alchemist being paired with Final Fantasy, is that if you listen to a lot of Alchemist beats, they're really, really slow. Which makes sense. A lot of the artists that he pairs with, from West Side, going back to even to Prodigy, they're like this real moody, dreary, laid back, but very dark things. And so they're very slow paced. Makes a lot of space for these rappers to rap over. And I was like, but a battle theme in Final Fantasy needs a little bit more pushing. And you know what I found? Alchemist's microphone from the Slaughterhouse Project. And I was like, shoot, that is it. There's a lot of energy. It's a little bit of bombast, and I feel that for a lot of JRPG players, they don't want, when they want to be in a battle, they want to feel a little bit of kineticism. And I think this is one of his more faster paced beats. Microphone, Slaughterhouse, excellent. And then I was thinking, all right, what's the town music? What's the town in Final Fantasy going to need? And I was thinking about, what if you ended up in a more like a hot town, maybe going through a desert area, but not necessarily even that, even just something more of like, I'm in the mood for like, maybe even a little tropical space, right? Like my brain was more so thinking some of the FF10 places locales that you go to, a little bit tropical spaces, energy. I thought about the work that he did with Billy Woods, and I totally forgot the other guy's name, but they come together to make Arm & Hammer. Black Sunlight. It's been one of my favorite songs over the last few years, and I'm just like, it's this paradise, real smooth, and I'm like, I could see like going to like Walker's Village, and if it's a not dark time, or more of like, if you're trying to set more of a jovial moment to go shop and do like speak to villagers, Black Sunlight is so great for something like this. And so these are the three artists that I was like, you know what? You pair them. I picked RPGs to pan out with. Now, I'm going to just throw out two that I'm not going to do the song breakdowns for, but I was playing around with it. I was ruminating. I mean, I'm just going to say Madlib and Persona. Madlib and Persona just feels like the level of stylishness, the level of eclecticism. I think Persona evokes that. Madlib's skill set matches that. I think that's just a seamless match. One person who I think has some range, but I just couldn't think of the OST to pair him with, is High Tech. I almost had him with the Final Fantasy soundtrack, where I was like, oh yes, High Tech, Final Fantasy, music is my life, but I was just like, there's something just not sitting, and I couldn't figure it out. But I think that he has a range and skill set and sound that I feel like can match this. Another one that I just think that he'd be great at, if they do a Xenoblade Chronicles X sequel, you gotta get Just Blaze. The triumphant bombast, but he can be a little bit laid back. He needs to, like, I'm thinking about the tune that he did for Martian Ambrosius to get like some more atmospheric fauna. I think those two diametric tones, I think he can do. And I think obviously the Xenoblade X soundtrack was very much trying to do hip hop in town. I know people hate it, but whatever. I think if you put Just Blaze to do that town music, if you do Just Blaze to do some of these boss battles, you are going to get something triumphant and great. Or you could argue to me, right? One of the interesting things is that for Xenoblade Chronicles X, again, I'm leaning in on that game because there's a tone and different musicality going on, is the town is called New LA. I've mentioned no West Coast producers here, and so I will admit my ignorance to a lot of West Coast producers. I mean, obviously I could say Dr. Dre, but the person who I was spending some time with, because I'm a little bit more familiar with their work, DJ Quick. And maybe DJ Quick could do something for the town and for the space. I just don't, I feel like with West Coast music, and this is where I think you could argue it for each of the other producers, but I felt with West Coast music, there's such a specificness that's evocative of them, that if you throw it into a fantasy setting, that it just may not translate. It may be too much of a barrier. I feel like even though there's a regionality to Prince Paul, that it feels like it can translate to a different fantasy setting. I feel like a lot of West Coast music has such clean, evocative representations of that space that it makes you wonder, is like, how does this represent this place? And that's why I went, maybe New LA is enough. Maybe spending time in New LA and creating a scene that either evocative of Dre or DJ Quick, maybe that would do it. And so those are my choices. Please let me know which hip-hop producers you think would be excellent at doing a JRPG soundtrack. I think there's a need to respect the art form. And I think also, this is just me personally, JRPG music can be a little bit repetitive. As a person who's gone through digging through a lot of OSTs, I'm gonna throw shots at my boy Matoi Sakuraba. He feels like he often makes the same thing over and over again, and I think there are certain touchstones and things that you do in JRPG soundtracks, either to evoke a element or something of that nature, that it becomes generic. Part of the reason why I even suggest this is that I think the genre can use just some musical tuning up. Not even tuning up is not the word. Some musical freshness to add some new blood and give it just a different context and vibe. Now, let's get into our Hall of Fame picks, music-wise, for the week. And the first one, so I took shots at Sakuraba, so I'm gonna start with the one that I was gonna end with. The Scratch on Ice from Tales of Rebirth. Now, I couldn't find the original composer, so forgive me, especially if this is a Sakuraba joint, forgive me for slandering. But one of the things that I've always found powerful about JRPG music is how much it can evoke elements even when you don't see it, evoke feelings. So there is this like twinkling piano. Notice I'm going to say that so many times. There are these subtle synths in the background, and then what I find so beautiful is the types of synths that they add on top of that feel like a voice. It feels like a mist. It's beautiful. I mean, there's like a little like a triangle noise in the background for percussion, and all I could imagine was like, oh, I can be solving some Tales of puzzles in this. I can see like pushing ice blocks, and I think one of the things that make a lot of JRPG music great is that they're ideal for looping. They're not just music to push in the background, but I think some other games kind of lean into be more cinematic. But it's also like I can get lost in the atmosphere of a song the way that it would do for a dungeon, and so there's a little droning on experience in this. So Scratch on Ice, Tales of Rebirth. I'm guessing it's an ice level. I'd be surprised if it was not. Another one, Junior Number 2. Now I don't believe this is the right one, but it's what they have on Spotify. This is from Xenosaga 2 by Yuki Kajuro. One of the things that stereotypes I'm going to throw at JRPG soundtrack, I mentioned synths, I mentioned mist. The one thing that these cats know how to do is kill a piano tune. A very peaceful, tranquil piano that they just let prance. They just let it breathe. And you're just like there, and there's no other instruments for a while. And then later they add this like teardrop sound effect. And sometimes it sounds like that, where you're like, oh, I'm sure it's just a piano playing it, but it sounds like a sound effect. I've spent an unhealthy amount of time at one point in time looking for synthesizer boxes from the 90s to try to capture certain noises. Now, obviously, Xenosaga is mid-2000s, but it's the same thing where there's just sound fonts that come across that I'm just like, how do you do that now? And so how do I hear something that makes me think of a teardrop? It's beautiful. And then they have the operatic singing on top. Another thing that people, JRPG music loves to do. I think the song is great. It's really brisk. It's really quick. Want to mention that. And then lastly, Ancient Tomb of Sai by Kenji Ito for Saga Frontier. And I just want to mention the log drum. Like, this song is very much of, oh, I'm going to a fire town. You can feel the smoke, the synths coming later. It's all of that. But I just want to mention the log drum. There's something about hearing a really good, unique drum in a song that just is like the rest of it needs to be there to set the mood of like a billowy smoking chimney and things of that nature. But that's actually why I added this. I was originally thinking that there's a little bit of what's the phrase I want to use? There's a little bit of like original Japanese music in that sound, the traditional folk music, and I think just the way that they integrate that drum to communicate that it's just good. I haven't played Saga Frontier, hope to play it someday. So those are my 3 Hall of Fame picks this week for great all-time JRPG music. And that wraps up this week's Menu Combat. Let me know what you think. It was great talking with you all this week. I appreciate your time, and press pause, customize your party, and relax. Much love. You can follow me at TheWolvesDen25 both on Instagram and Twitter, and you can follow the podcast directly at Menu Combat on Twitter and Instagram. And if you have any questions, email menucombat@gmail.com. I would love to answer more.